This is the Board Hawk Podcast. I'm Alan Gottlieb.
And I'm Alexis Minopel Harrigan.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Board Hawk Podcast. It's been a few weeks since we've done an episode. There's been a lot of churn in the background, but not a lot exciting happening overtly. So we just have taken a little break. And I'm going to show you where I am because I'm at the home of some friends in northern Idaho on a lake, Lake Pend Oreille, way up near Sandpoint, hours south of the Canadian border. Our guest today is Van Scholes, who's been with us before, and most of you who are listening probably know, but I'll do a quick introduction of him, and then I'll tell you what we're talking about today. Van's been active in Colorado and Denver public education for more than 25 years as a teacher, charter school founder and leader, advocacy organization executive, and as an influential voice locally and nationally in education change efforts. Recently, Van has honed his AI skills using Claude AI, and combined with his deep knowledge and keen data sense, has been doing some interesting in-depth analyses of important Colorado and national education issues. This week, with the release of the 2026 state testing CMAS results, we published his examination of Colorado's recent boasts, thanks to the magazine U.S. News, that it is number one in education nationally. Van, like many other of our guests, doesn't shy away from telling hard truths, so it should be an interesting conversation as we dig into that claim and into what the numbers really tell us. So, Van, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Van.
Great. Well, let's jump in by starting with the press release that the state put out, Colorado Department of Education and the governor's office, about the CMAS results, trumpeted the fact once again that U.S. News and World Report said that Colorado's number one in education, which seems, even on the surface, a bit disingenuous. What's your high-level take based on this analysis you've done of the new CMAS data, which, by the way, we published on Board Hawk yesterday? And what does it tell you about where we really are given NAEP scores, which are the National Nations Report Card, and other things?
Yeah. Well, first off, like, some good news. The state is improving, particularly on math, which a number of us have been screaming about in one way or another for a while. So we are seeing improvement, but suggest that Colorado is somehow number one, with the exception of this ranking that comes from U.S. News and World Report, which is sort of this weird combo of figures that are higher ed numbers with early childhood numbers. That, because of the way the math is done, it allows Colorado to end up in the number one spot. But if you look at any of the indicators in terms of achievement indicators from NAEP, which is the best measure that we have, it's sort of the gold standard for comparing states and comparing populations of kids within states, or look at the numbers in terms of who's going to college and how many kids are going to college, those sorts of things. Colorado ends up being overall somewhere in the middle, or sometimes in the top half of the middle. And Colorado for 20 plus years has been that way. Sometimes we end up in the top quarter, and often we end up in the top 50%, but it's more towards the average nationally in general. And then the most recent numbers in Colorado suggest that that's where we are now. I will say that I did look at how are we doing with the CMAS scores, which is their state test. How are we doing compared to other states that have their state tests released? And unfortunately, there aren't that many that have the data released for 2026. But of those states, again, Colorado's in the middle. We didn't look exceptionally better at making improvements. And so one of my frustrations is that, we live in a time where, unfortunately, as I said in the piece, where there are a lot of politicians, and especially our president, that, has normalized lying about the facts on anything. And I feel like there are more and more politicians or leaders that think it's okay to be sort of braggadocious in one way or another. And it's not untrue that Colorado did get this U.S. News and World Report ranking of number one, but it is untrue to suggest that we're somehow number one in terms of achievement or any of the other things that most of us would consider
That's
One
right.
thing I wanted to
Well,
follow up
reality.
with, one thing I wanted to follow up with on that is like, what do you feel is the practical impact of exaggerating Colorado's status in terms of its education performance? I mean, what does that hurt or help?
Yeah, it's suggestive that we don't need to do anything about where we are. It's also suggestive that what we're doing is working. And so we should just keep on doing what we're doing. And as I point out in this piece, one of the sort of frustrating things about Colorado, and sometimes difficult for those of us that would like to see the system get better, is that we are among the most educated states when it comes to adults with degrees. So, depending on the year, where Connecticut or Massachusetts or Colorado has the highest number of adults with college degrees. And so that tends to mask how many kids from Colorado go on to college. And so we are number one in the country at the gap between those that have college degrees and the number of kids that move through the system that get college degrees. So
And that's the old Colorado paradox, right?
and that's the old
Yeah.
paradox. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as we've talked before, I hate the term paradox. I prefer for it to be, I'm calling it the mirage or the
Mhm.
mist, because it's somehow suggestive that we don't have a deep problem in this state as it relates to K-12, but also higher ed. So it's as if we showed up at this big fun group dinner and it comes time for the bill and we're going to divide it up and look at a 20% tip. And we're like, got to run to the bathroom. Oh, the car's waiting outside. And we are just going to like run off. So we're shirking our responsibility in terms of actually supporting our own kids and or the kids that were here before, I immigrated with that degree from Michigan or Wisconsin or whatever particular state is that's actually investing in creating a college degree for me.
And I just want to dig a little bit deeper into that. I think you did a nice summary, Van, of describing that mirage, the Colorado mirage. I like that term instead of the Colorado paradox. In the U.S. News and World Report, half of the score was for higher ed. We're number 3 in higher ed. And part of that includes being the number 1 for educational attainment of adult residents. And so to your point, the challenge with that is a lot of folks who came, who are reflective of that number, didn't get their degrees in Colorado. They didn't graduate from CU or DU or CSU, wherever. They brought those degrees, sometimes advanced degrees, with them from another state, maybe even another country. And so what we're not looking at then is, in these figures, is what the educational attainment is, higher ed or advanced degrees of Colorado raised and Colorado graduated students. And in fact, what's fascinating about your analysis and looking at, I have the Board Hawk article up right now, is you have one column on the left with the higher ed information, on the column on the right with the K-12 information. High school graduation rate for Colorado was number 39 in the 50 state ranking. So how do you then reconcile that gap, right, between, great, most college educated adults, but how many of those actually came through Denver Public Schools, Littleton Public Schools, Colorado Springs, wherever?
Yeah, it's a huge problem, particularly if we, go back to the premise that, well, college isn't for everyone. And I want to be very clear about that. That I think there's a lot of information and research that suggests that a lot of the skills and habits and even knowledge that one gets by having a college degree are becoming more and more important in this age of AI and everything else in terms of problem solving. And we also know from, there's a famous study at Georgetown that everybody cites that suggests that, 70% of the jobs are going to require some sort of higher education degree.
The thing
And
that we get,
so
sorry for interrupting you there, Van. The thing we also don't talk about enough, I think, is the social capital you build through a college education. I
right.
am the first in my family to graduate high school, the first to go to college, and much more than the content of what I learned of, I would say the social capital that I built by going to college, the soft skills that I built going to college and how to talk to people, how to communicate was far more valuable than, what I learned with my incredible liberal arts degree that I don't use today. And so it would be really fascinating, and it's a little bit of a tangent here, if there were some sort of study that was done on the social capital of folks who graduate from Colorado high schools versus those who, are now the workforce in leadership across our state. So like, even if we were to take, let's say, like the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce or Colorado Concern, if you were to do an analysis of the members of those organizations, how many of them were born in Colorado and graduated with a degree from Colorado? I'd be interested to know that. I felt.
Yeah. Just as an aside, the last time that I remember actually being at one of those meetings, this is pre-pandemic, so numbers may have changed, but it was actually at the Denver Metro Chamber, and it was a pretty big meeting. There was hundreds of people there, and somebody asked that question, and half the people said they had degrees from somewhere else. So that's reflective
Yeah.
of sort of where we are. And again, like, it's not, I have a future son-in-law that's, just getting his journeyman's as an electrician, and and those are good jobs, and
AI proof job.
yeah, it's but many of these other things are often tickets to nowhere. And the other thing that I'll say about Colorado is that, we've done things like back in 2008, there was a law passed that we were going to create this sort of pathways to success, which included college as well as other things. And we were going to have a data pipeline that would allow us to see what kids were doing, where they were going, how successful they were, and whether or not they're getting jobs. And that's 2008, it's 2026. We're still talking about connecting. We barely connect K-12 to higher ed, and we don't connect anything to jobs. And there's all this talk of internships, school to work stuff, but we don't really have any data on that. And so,
At the
so we're constantly sort of, I would say, making decisions on policy with, at least one eye, and, the other
I'll
one
just push back for
needing
1 second.
cataract surgery. Sure.
And I don't know if it was this year or the year, I think it was the year before, where we actually are making efforts to try to do more data transfer about degrees. And I don't know if that was legislation or if that was something the department did, but they're making attempts. But the fact that, yeah, it's 2008.
I know, yes, there is, but I can't tell you if, Think Brain, for instance, is doing a great job of getting people into work and into
Right.
the sectors that need that. Like, I should be able to tell you that in the same way that I can
Right.
tell you how school districts are doing in terms of low-income kids and their SAT
Yep.
math scores. So, yeah, and I don't want to change the subject, but one other thing that I wanted to say, sort of globally, stepping back, is, I've been doing this stuff. You said 25 years. I should update it. It's now like, gosh, I've been doing education stuff in Denver since 1996. So
30,
that's 30
I'm 1 year.
years.
I'm 1 year ahead of you.
Okay, so I'm old. I've been doing, like, probably since 2004, or no, 2003. I've been doing, like, analyses of, grad rates or state test scores or whatever. And so I've been doing this for a long time in one way or another. And then, as is the case now, what happens, unfortunately, is that we have press conferences, as we had on Wednesday. Somebody gets out and talks and says, well, here are the test scores. Oh, we're a little disappointed, or we're really psyched that things have gotten better. And then we move on. And we never, like, dig into any of this. Like, in my thing, I think on Boardwalk, but also I've done it a bunch of times. you do these scatter plots where you look at sort of how kids are doing on achievement or graduation or college or whatever, and you compare it to sort of the demographics, and you find that there are these bands that are like half the graph or at least a third of the graph in terms of variation. And so some places are doing really well, some places are doing terrible. And we sort of say like, oh, that's cool. And we maybe give an award to some of the schools on the higher end of that predicted line. But otherwise we just sort of move on. And like if there was a pandemic going on and we were testing some new drug to deal with whatever the symptoms, or we were testing a new, some sort of, whatever, some new drug, we never do that. We would say, oh my gosh, what's happening in that place? Let's dig down into it. And what's happening in the place down below? Let's find out what's different between those two things. And let's stop doing that stuff and let's do more of that. Let's try and understand what's going on up here. And we don't have a culture when it comes to education policy where that happens hardly at all. It's a very
It's funny.
rare thing. So
I had a beer the other day with our mutual friend Rob Stein, who's now the acting superintendent in Jeffco, and he said the exact same thing about how if education only acted more like medical research and actually looked at treatments that were effective and then replicated them and expanded them, we'd be in a lot better place than we are the way we operate today, which is pretty much what you just said exactly.
no, it's as if we've barely noticed that there's this new thing we discovered called bacteria or whatever, but we keep noticing that, E. coli seems to show up in places and people drop dead. But we're not doing anything about like making sure that our vegetables don't have E. coli on. So
we used to.
Yes.
But to your point, like, the fact that the semblance of the CDE that we now have under Robert F. Kennedy, like, you have at least information going out like, hey, the popsicles that you like, which were mine, I'm really sad, are now recalled because they have glass in them. Great to know. Wouldn't it be nice as a parent to know, hey, the school you're sending your kid to, if they are a Black student whose parents don't have high school or college degree, is less likely to achieve at this school than at this school. I would want to know that as a parent. The way that I know that the popsicle that I'm about to give my kid is going to, have glass.
I think part of it's not wanting to hurt anybody's feelings.
I don't care
way too much of
anymore.
that. I know. That's what it comes down to. It's like, we don't want to make that school feel bad about itself.
Right.
So
And I also want to say that like a lot of my analyses, I use numbers, and the reason why I use the numbers isn't because I don't believe that qualitative measures around what a quality school is, measuring culture and all kinds of other things are also really important. It's just that's all I have access to. And so, and that's really important as a caveat to all of this stuff.
Yeah. Let's just sort of stay. I had a lot of other things I wanted to say about higher ed based partly on the report I'm working on for Van and the Keystone Center, but that would get us way off topic. So maybe we should do this again and start talking about that once that report's out. But let's walk through pieces of your piece on Boardwalk sort of section by section without getting too wonky. But let's go back to sort of the K-12 side, because we talked about higher ed a bit just now. What are the NAEP results that tell us about where Colorado really stands and whether that position has really changed for better or worse over the years, particularly as it relates to low income students, which I think is what really matters, because as you pointed out in your piece, the kids of affluent, highly educated parents, school is a nice add-on, but for lower income kids, it is the main intervention in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases. So really what we want to look at is how Colorado really is doing with those students, low income students and students of color who tend to need that intervention more.
Right. Yeah. And we find that Colorado, is again, sort of doing average, which is not that great. And in some cases is doing worse. So, I think I have a bar chart, like where did Colorado rank on NAEP for the last time we had math or NAEP was 2024. So if the state test is indicative, we're doing better, but so is probably the rest of the country. And so, we're, for grade 4 math, for instance, economically disadvantaged, we're 28th. Okay. So, that's pretty far from number 1. Not economically disadvantaged, we're number 9. So we see in Colorado, reflected in almost all of the data, some pretty massive achievement gaps, which my hypothesis is that that's related back to this question that we talked about, importing talent. And so my guess is that the folks that are coming from out of state, I don't have data around this, but that with college degrees from other places, I'm going to guess that their kids are probably doing marginally better than the kids that are, multi-generation Coloradans, at least based on the data. Maybe I'm wrong, but the data would suggest that, or at least I'll throw that out as a hypothesis.
I do appreciate that the NAEP scores do allow you to do that analysis of students based on economic disadvantages or not. And this is my PSA for any DPS parents or any parents listening in right now. If your kids are going back to school, please fill out your free and reduced lunch form, even if you don't qualify for free and reduced price lunch, so that we do have accurate data about how students are doing based on, or being able to analyze that against parents' income. So I always roll my eyes. I'm like, I don't need to fill this out. Yes, I do. Accountability
Yes.
to other parents, please fill out the free reduced lunch forms. Okay, PSA over.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. No, it's really important to know this stuff.
Just so looking at the CMS data for a minute, Van, what did you see in terms of trends and everything else? And again, low income kids, kids of color, as well as overall in Colorado, about math, ELA, and also then, at the high school level, like the SAT data. What did you see there?
Yeah, so we saw more improvement, just as the state said in their press release or in the press conference. We saw more improvement on math than we did in literacy. And we saw more improvement at the elementary and middle school levels than we did high school. We didn't see much change in the high school. And again, I'll just throw out a couple of hypotheses. I don't know this to be true, but we think that it's easier for kids to either pick up math or lose math when they go to school, which kind of makes sense. Most of us don't learn math at home. Literacy is much more dependent upon what's happening in the home. And so because of that, schools have probably less of an impact on literacy than schools do on math. And so we saw that in the pandemic. We saw that when kids weren't in school, their math scores dropped precipitously. And they dropped faster than they did for literacy scores. And we're seeing that now as kids are back in school, that the steepness of the improvement is better on the math side than it is on the literacy side. I would say the other thing is that I think it's harder to move the needle on when kids get into high school. Schools have less of an impact. There's been all kinds of studies around this, particularly on basic achievement stuff, for better or worse. A lot of it gets baked in for most kids in the earlier grade. So
intuitively, what you're saying about the math versus literacy and the effects of home environment, intuitively that makes sense. I'm not totally convinced, though, because I think about the interventions, particularly on literacy and the passage of the READ Act, and anecdotally, just my own child who was struggling with reading, who through interventions went from, a couple of grade levels behind on reading to actually like winning a literacy award because of his growth. I will say, I do think interventions make a huge difference when you can target those interventions. And I know that's not exactly what you were saying, but
yeah,
I just
totally.
like caveat in that comment about, I do think some of these interventions work, but how, we don't have the funding to do them at the level
Right.
school by school.
Right. There have been periodically there are people, even leaders of states or the country, that raise questions around the value of school. And so one of the things that we discovered through the pandemic, or we were reminded, that school matters. If kids aren't in school, they don't learn as much. And that's true for literacy and math. I just wanted to suggest that, all of us should be reading. If we have kids that are younger kids, we should be reading to them every night. And that's a good thing to do. And very few of us hang out with our kids and do math with them outside of whatever the school asks us to do. There are occasionally some people that are building stuff and do that, but most of us don't.
So you mentioned, there are some leaders who want to just, you didn't say these words, I'm putting these words in your mouth, basically abolish education. We don't need it. But we do have leaders who are running for governor right now. So we have Victor Marx, then we have Phil Weiser running for governor.
Right.
Governors come in, they usually have their own agendas on education. I've seen that with the last two, where they do some sort of workforce, some sort of committee. They have to figure out a way that they're going to work with the Colorado Department of Education, because it's not through statute. It doesn't report into the governor. It's independent. What guidance would you give to Victor Marx or Phil Weiser in how they're showing up as potentially our next governor and dealing with this data?
Right. Well, first off, I'd want to start with the question of, does public education matter? Do you think that it has an impact on building communities or on the economic development of a community or a state, et cetera? I think we have to first do some real basic stuff, because I think that there are a lot of folks. I don't think that we can assume that's the case. I believe that it does, and I think the research shows that it does. But again, some people don't believe that.
Here in Northern Idaho, nobody believes it.
Right. So once we get beyond that, then I would say, really, again, rather than starting with this is what we need to do, I would just hope that they and their senior staff would take an honest look at where we are. How is Colorado doing, and what do you want Colorado to do? And then looking back, what are all the different levers that you have? And I get it that, a Colorado governor has less power than many other governors, because we have a very decentralized system. We have a Department of Education that, basically is mostly a pass-through for federal money. Having said that, the governor has enormous power with a bully pulpit. So does the Commissioner of Education. And there are a variety, and there are lots of policy things that could be done. And the state has a history of passing laws to try and improve education and then forgetting about them and moving on to the next legislative session and layering another one on top of it, never really evaluating whether or not anything worked or not.
Amen.
So I think that, as an ex-geologist, we have these layers of policy strata that, we never bother to look at the fossils. Right. We have to and then get rid of stuff and then really look at it. And it's not to suggest that just deregulating things is gonna, because we know actually just deregulating things only just sort of exacerbates differences. We need to look at, where are the priorities again? What are the levers and so on and so forth? I'm super excited that we have full day K and we have early childhood education. How are we going to figure out if any of it's working? What's quality? How do we know that? So on and so forth. I'm super excited that Colorado is a national leader at creating sort of pathways from high school to work. Again, how do we know any of that's working or not? I am not so excited that the state really hasn't thought about school leadership, has no programs around it, has hardly anything at the moment around school improvement, and pays next to no attention around what's working or not. I know there's a legislative task force that's going to be looking at some of this, and I hope that they dig into it and it doesn't fall into this sort of ridiculous schism between the quote unquote reform people and the quote unquote union people, which is what usually happens.
The leadership piece is an interesting one, and I think very hard to affect at the state level with legislation. But that's where my personal passion and frustrations come in with the apathy that we see from voters, from parents, from community members at the district by district level. I was recently having a conversation with an education leader in our state, and I was just saying, like, anecdotally, I believe this is true. I would love to dig into the Secretary of State data on this, but in a lot of rural districts, we have hard time getting people to run for school boards, for example. And they told me actually in some rural districts, there's no limit. And so people have been on the school board for like 30 years. And like that may be great, but that could also be an opportunity for some really bad stuff too. So I guess I don't know where I'm going with this little rant, but I think it's incumbent on us, from the governor all the way down to local voters voting on who their school board members are, to pay attention and don't just take Instagram or TikTok post about we're number one at face value. Like, do some critical thinking, people, please.
Yeah. And I'll say, like when I look back on the history of education in Colorado, like there were governors actually on both sides of the aisle. Like Governor Owens did all kinds of, he was a Republican, not a Trump Republican, but a Republican. It was pre-Trump, or at least Trump was busy talking about how tall his buildings were when they were actually not as tall. But
Bankrupting casinos.
Right. But anyway, Bill Owens did a lot of really interesting and good things on the education front. And so did Roy Romer, who was a Democrat. So, and both of them have had impacts that have been lasting, that have made Colorado better than it was prior to them having been governors. So
give Jared Polis credit, like the full day preschool.
Yeah.
That's huge. Or I'm sorry, the kindergarten, that's huge.
Yeah.
They move toward more preschool is great.
No,
That's
no question. Yeah,
and
no,
I think
no.
that's
I
still
know,
is
and
part of his legacy.
Yeah, I'm guessing that it will. But again, as is the case with all these other folks, Romer like standards and stuff, but we're nice. We have standards, but there's no accountability for standards. It's not his fault, but we don't really have any. So
I wanted to touch on a couple of more data points from your piece before we sign off. The first one, and the last one's DPS, but the first one is the section you wrote about how the state's doing in terms of graduating kids and then preparing them for work in college, which are not the same thing, obviously.
One little side note, and I pointed out in the piece, is that like our graduation numbers are, of course, better than what the federal reported graduation numbers are. And that's typically the case in most states, I'll just say. So,
Okay. Let me just veer a little bit off into a tangent, which is one of the things that you found was in terms of not only high school graduation, but preparing kids for college, and just on some of your data charts, in particular, DSST network high schools just butt over almost any other schools in the state. And again, I'm working on this report for you on higher ed ROI, and the work that they do, the intentionality of the work they do, I think explains a lot of that. But and I'm sure we'll have you back on when that report gets released. But what do you see in terms of like why and why that works so well, what they're doing, and over time it has worked so well, and why? And this is more of a philosophical question and kind of a leading question: why, since it so clearly does work, does nobody else emulate them, especially districts?
Right. I think that Alexis and I were talking about this before we started recording, a little bit about different types of school models. And I think, unfortunately, it's very uncommon to find schools that do what they say. And there's often a disconnect between schools' description of their philosophy and practice and how that translates into what happens in the classroom in terms of how people behave in the hallways, adults and kids. And DSST,
it's easy to put core values on the wall, but
right.
Does anybody actually pay attention to what they mean?
Attention to it, yeah. And DSST, for better or worse, you either like the model or you don't. But they say that they're about preparing kids to get into and succeed in college. And lo and behold, they do that. The data suggests that they do that better than other places. And they have a whole host of practices around that. Some of them are around preparing kids academically. Some of them are around sort of making sure that they and their families are oriented towards them and and helping them with getting them there, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that they do all of those things, but I think sort of stepping back, it's that they actually do those things. And it also means they don't do some other things. I wrote or worked on a paper, wrote part of it that came out with Future Ed and at Georgetown we put out last year. Well, it talked about what's a quality school and the research around what a quality school, and this has been going on for, since the late 60s. We know that one indicator of a quality school is that an intentionality around a focus. And so I think DSST, and I think what's really remarkable is it's not just a school, it's a group of schools. So they've been able to replicate those practices in a group. That's really, really hard to do. And to answer your question about like, why isn't, I think, we have a culture in education where the first thing that we think about when somebody's done well on something, most of us in education, we say, oh, they're cheating, or they have a different group of kids, or they have more money, or whatever. That's just sort of, and it's really different than my dad was a medical researcher. Like when somebody gets some new data, they don't immediately think that they're cheating. They go into it with some skepticism, but they're like, holy cow, what is it that they're doing? How'd they get those numbers that way? I want to understand that. And then I'll jump to some conclusions about whether or not it's replicable or whatever. We don't do that.
I want to add a little bit more color to this as a parent of a DSST middle schooler. That school works really well for my son. I don't know that it's going to work as well for right. Like, and that's going to be a decision my husband and I have to make when we're doing choice for my next middle schooler. But there are trade-offs, and some parents, and we talked about this a little bit on the podcast before, Alan. You're not going to get the traditional high school experience that a lot of people associate with their high school experience. Like you're not going to get the band group because there's no band. You're not going to get the performing arts. You're not going to get the high school football pep rallies, right? Like they have pep rallies, but it's not the same type of like traditional giant high school. And a lot of that, and I don't want to use the word fluff, because for some student, that band or that orchestra is actually like the thing that kept them in school, the thing that helped them graduate, right? And so I think it's incumbent on parents to understand like what's the motivating factor for your child? What is it that helps them succeed in that school, and be laser focused on that. And I was also sharing with Van before we started, one of the factors that helped me be very clear that DSST was the right school was we were going between like DSST, Maury, Highline. Highline was just a little bit too small for us, but it was really between DSST and Maury. And no knock to Maury, but a little bit, yes. The check-in process, like the fact that when we were doing the open house or the open back, like the family night of like, hey, come tour the school, do like an open house. It was like a 20-minute wait to like check in at the front office at Maury. It's like, you knew we were coming. Why is there a line to get into the front office to then get into the auditorium? And then like it started late. It was all this stuff versus at DSST, like they curated that event so well that parents knew exactly what to expect. It was like they had it start on time, end on time. They had things for students to do. They had student ambassadors there. And I give them a ton of credit. Like if they're going to do something, they do it very well. And that's what one of the things I love about DSST is they don't half-ass anything. And I think that's because they don't have a lot of other things and distractions to distract them from their core focus, which is getting students to college or getting students to graduate academically in a good spot.
Yeah. And again, I want to say, like, it has to do with focus. It's not necessarily the DSST program. The different thing. That's what a good school is.
And I've been
and
in
so
others.
and as somebody Yeah, and as somebody that went to project-based schools and and has had some learning disabilities when I was a kid and actually has a verbal SAT score of 400. So I get it that like and I didn't get into all the schools I wanted to because I had such crappy SAT scores. Like
Me.
that,
That's
that
hate you.
that's right. Yes, I'm grateful I didn't go to Cornell. So like kids are different and different kids need different kinds of programs and they need different kinds of supports and it needs to be individualized and schools need to the people need to be parents need to know that when helping choose schools and the schools have to be flexible about providing those supports.
Right. Okay. We've gone pretty long, which is great because it's been a good and wider ranging conversation than I had originally intended. But for our listeners who care primarily about DPS, I did want to at least touch on, and again, this isn't in part of your piece, but I know you've done some looking into it because you've sent me some stuff. What did you see in terms of the latest CMS scores and what's going on in DPS? Again, particularly among low-income kids of color.
Right. Yeah. So Denver I would describe it as a like Denver is doing slightly better in some cases than the state. I think that I think the folks that and maybe me included that have been very unhappy with Morero's leadership were surprised that maybe the scores didn't tank or something, and they didn't. And but neither did they go up. They're again, there's a range of things, but I would say that Denver was like, and it's a reminder. I think that I was talking to somebody else earlier this week about sort of the roles of superintendents. So it's a little bit like the roles of governors and state scores. It's really hard to move the needle on a school district with, now a multi-billion-dollar budget and, you know, thousands of employees and close to 100,000 kids and yada, yada, yada. It's really, really hard to do that. You either have to be incredibly amazing leader with lots of really good levers, or you have to be incredibly terrible and do whatever you can do to destroy the place. And most superintendents are neither of those things. And I'd say that Alex Marrero is somewhere in between there, depending on what I think he's not a very good superintendent, but the
Could be
machine,
much worse.
so he could be much worse. He could be much worse. And the system would probably still move along. And
It takes Trump level malfeasance to like drive something into the ground as quickly as Trump has driven parts of the United States into the ground. And Alex Marrero, as critical as I am of him as well, is not Donald Trump in that regard. He is nowhere near
Alex
that.
is phenomenal at maintaining a status quo.
Yeah. Well, but I would say that almost anybody, like, it's just really hard. It's really hard to move the needle one way or the other in a place like Denver. And, in Denver, when you look at the overall numbers in Denver, it's sort of like an exaggeration of the state. If you happen to be white and not poor, you're doing amazing in Denver. In fact, it's probably the best place to be other than maybe Boulder. It's better than Dougco or Cherry Creek like white kids do really well in Denver. But if you're poor, you're now doing about the same as you are in the rest of the state. If you're Latino, I think I looked at the Latino numbers and they're basically the same as other places. And in some other districts, you're much worse off being Latino than in Denver. So, yeah. So
Hardly a billboard to put up on the side of the highway.
Yeah. No, and it is hardly for those that think Alex Marrero is amazing, nor that for those of us that maybe think he needs to go. So
that's a podcast for another day.
Yeah.
Right. Van, thanks so much for coming on. This has been a really interesting conversation. Again, I'm sure we'll have you back on for multiple things going forward in the future. Any last words, Alexis? I think I've had my say.
This was great. Thanks so much, Van.
Okay.
Always love to have you on.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. It's fun. I wish I could dive off that balcony into the, but
I'm gonna go swimming in a few minutes here. Yeah.
oh, good.
Talk to you later.
Okay. Okay, good.